Hello everyone, Tom Simmons here with another installment for our personal financial literacy course, and this video is going to focus on real estate. For most Americans, real estate, buying their home, is going to be the single biggest investment of their lifetime, and it can be scary. Even for people with no loans or very little use of credit card, you're probably going to have a mortgage and owe $100,000 or more for a 30-year period of your life. You may not have stocks or bonds or other assets. Your home becomes your asset. Hopefully it will increase in value over time, and that's why we look at it as an investment. It's also going to be the biggest expense you have through your lifetime, especially when you consider the property taxes that you'll be paying on that home for the rest of your life. And you'll be paying a lot more for that home based on interest than you actually realize when you buy it up front. So since this is such a big investment, such a big move, and has such an impact on most Americans' finances, that's why we're devoting one class specifically to the real estate market. And of course, this is a topic that is an entire class in and of itself, so I'm only going to be able to give you some very basics about this market. Now, when most people think of owning property, they come to it with the idea of, well, this is my property, so this is mine. And especially if you come from an urban area or a suburban area where you've got nice straight fences in between your property and the next guy, you may come to the table with the idea that if I own property, it's mine. I can stop anyone else from coming onto it, and I can do what I want here. And that simply isn't the case anymore. It used to be, many years ago, that the fundamental concept of real estate was something called purchasing a fee simple absolute. And if you look at old court records, purchasing land in fee simple absolute was very much a standard way of buying land. And it meant three things. One, it meant you had the right to possess that property. Two, it meant you had the right to exclude people from that property. And three, it meant you had the right to alienate that property. And what that means is you have the right to sell it if you've decided you want to move or no longer need or want that particular piece of property. And that's the concept of the fee simple absolute. Well, it's not so simple anymore. And of course it wasn't all that simple back then either, because many properties were sold or conveyed as fee simple defeasibles. Now I know I'm throwing a lot of terms at you right now, but I want to try and get as much as we can into this video. In a fee simple defeasible, you have all those rights to that property unless you do something wrong. For instance, I might convey a piece of property to you as long as you use the property for a school. And if you don't, it reverts to me. That's a completely, perfectly legal way to transfer property. And in fact, I can think of a piece of property back in New York where I grew up where someone did precisely that. They said, you can have this property as long as you use it for a church. And if you don't, that property reverts to me. And when the church burned down, they tried to sell the property and they found they couldn't because no buyer wanted to buy it, knowing that that could revert to someone else if they didn't use it as a church. Or you can say, this property is yours, I convey this property to you in exchange for $10,000 as long as you use it for a school. And if you don't, I have the right to re-enter. It's not an automatic thing, but I have the right to force you to give it back. Or it could be something as simple as I went through a divorce. And when I went through that divorce, I sold my half of the property to my ex. But there was a provision in that conveyance that said, if my ex sold that property within 7 years of the divorce, I had the first right of refusal. In other words, my ex had to come to me for approval before selling it to someone else. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. And I gave the approval, I gave the permission. But properties can be conveyed with conditions. And just because you see, oh, it's a piece of property and I like it, it doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want with it, because sometimes there are conditions, and these conditions are contained in the legal document that describes what you own, and that legal document is called a deed. Now, sometimes you get those funky kind of conditions. Other times, you may find, as you research your property and look at the deed, and this is why you hire lawyers to help you in this process, that there is an easement. And easements are very, very common, actually. Most utility companies have easements, meaning you own the property, but we have the right to enter it. They may even say to you, we have a telephone or an electric line or a water line that goes through your property, and you cannot build within X number of feet of this particular line, because that interferes with our right to our easement. And so the more urban you get, and the more gas lines, and the more water lines, the more sewer lines, and the more electric lines you get in that neighborhood, the more likely that there's going to be an easement of some type for either the municipality or these private companies to gain access to their property, meaning the pipes and the lines and things like that. There are also cases you may have heard of called adverse possession, where there's someone who has been using or living on or keeping their goods on your property for a long time. We used to call this squatter's rights, but the technical term is adverse possession, meaning they have openly and notoriously kept a shed on your property, or lived on your property, or kept some cars on a back piece of your property. Now, depending on the state, and I'll get more into this later, but it's all governed by state law, and the states are wildly different. Depending on the state, if they do that from anywhere to 5 to 30 years, depending on the state, they may have a right to continued use of that property. So you may purchase what you think is 100% yours, but someone else may have gained a right to use it or access it or even live on it through adverse possession. Similarly, excuse me, there's something called prescriptive rights, which is a very similar concept. And it simply means that someone has used, let's say, a path through your property for years, and they've used it to fish or go to a swimming hole or to access a road nearby to make it a shorter walk. And if they've done it for a number of years, and it's been very openly done and notoriously done, and you or the previous owner hasn't stopped them, they may have established a prescriptive right to use that path, even though you own the property. In Massachusetts, this is particularly the case in pathways that are called ancient ways. And it's very common in southeast Massachusetts in particular, where there's been an old cart road, could have been a Native American trail, or just a trail that people have used forever, and the courts will recognize a right in the public or some people to continue to use that particular trail, even though it passes through your property. So we think of, I'm buying a property and it's mine. Well, yes, it is, but the deed may grant rights to others, and this is why you're always going to hire an attorney and a title company to actually research what is specifically in that deed. Now, in addition to what might be in your specific deed, there are also general laws at all different levels of government that are also going to impact your right to the enjoyment of your property. So, for instance, at the federal level, every 10 years, the U.S. must conduct a census of the population. And Congress has specifically passed a law stating that when people are conducting the census, they have the legal right to access any property in order to gain that information. So every 10 years when the census is undertaken and people put out no trespassing signs, can't come into my property, yes, they can. Because a no trespassing sign only means that you cannot enter my property unless it's for a lawful purpose. And Congress has already said conducting the census is a lawful purpose, and therefore the census taker can ignore that no trespassing sign and walk up to your door, whether you like it or not. On a state level, many states, Vermont and Maine are among them, have state laws in place that specifically say that hikers, hunters, and fishermen have the right to freely access any property unless it's posted. And so when you see, when you go down the road and you see all these posted, no fishing, no hiking, no trespassing, etc., that's because without those signs, the public has a right to enter those properties to engage in those activities. So yes, I own a big piece of property. People have the right to access it unless I specifically post that no, you can't. Of course, if you live along a river or a watercourse in the eastern United States, you have the right to withdraw water from that river or watercourse as long as it's reasonable. And a court will determine what's reasonable based on the opinions and needs of all the other people living on that river. If you own coastal land, there is something called littoral, Littoral, littoral rights, which are your rights against the ocean. Well, if you live in Maine, Massachusetts, or New Hampshire, and you own coastal property, you own, and your deed says you own to the water, it means you own to the low water mark. So when the tide goes out, wherever that edge is, that's what you own to. In other states, you only own to the high water mark. So your deed may say, hey, I own this piece of land all the way to the ocean, but it's only to the high tide mark. So when the tide goes out and people are walking down your beach, you're not in a position of saying, hey man, get off my lawn, get off my sand, because you don't actually own that. If the ocean adds sand and distance to that particular stretch of beach, your property actually increases. And if winter storms carve away at it and erode your land, you actually lose land as a result. Every state's going to make these decisions on their own. One place where the state laws are really important is what happens if you die without a will and you have a piece of land. All your property is divided into two different categories: personal property and real property. Personal property is anything you can carry or throw in the back of your pickup truck or tow. So your chinaware and a hot tub that you have sitting freestanding on your back deck, your snowmobile, this is all real property. Real estate doesn't move. It stays where it is. So your land, your house is considered real property. An in-ground pool would be considered real property. And let's say you and your spouse, and you have some children, and you die without a will. Well, if you live in the state of Massachusetts, all right, under the law of the state of Massachusetts, all of your property goes to your spouse. But what happens if you have a piece of land up in the Adirondacks of New York? Because it's real estate, because it doesn't move, that property is divided by the laws of New York State, which are different than the laws of Massachusetts. And that means your property in New York State, the first $50,000 worth is going to your spouse, and the rest get divided between your spouse and the children of your marriage. And just to further complicate it, almost every state has different rules depending on whether the children belong to you and your spouse or were from previous marriages. So state law gets very, very complicated. And I hate when I go online on social media and someone asks a question such as, hey, well, I want to do this with my property, or I want to sell it this way. Can I do it? Who knows? It all depends on the state and the locality. There's no such thing as a real estate rule that's one size fits all, because it is so intensely local. And speaking of intensely local, that brings us down to the local level. Your right to do what you want to on your property is going to be affected by the existence of local zoning bylaws. And every town or county is different. They will have different setbacks, meaning how far away from property line you can build. They will have different laws regarding how close to a pond or a water course you can build, if you can clear the brush or the trees within within a certain distance of a pond or a stream. They will have use restrictions. You can't have a home business. You can have a home business, but it can't be retail. They get very complicated, and you'd be surprised at how many tiny New England towns with very few people have zoning bylaws that are 120 pages long. So we started this by looking at, gee, I want to buy a piece of property and it's mine and I can do what I want with it. And all of a sudden you find out there's a lot of restrictions that come, and a lot of obstacles that may be evident when you decide to do something with that property, which is why research is so much more a part of buying your property than just, oh, I fell in love with the house, I like the color, the kitchen's great. There's a lot of things that go into this. And if local zoning impacts you, there's an even smaller level of rules that may impact you, kind of a hyper-local set of rules, if you live in a homeowners association. There are a number of homeowners associations in our area. They're much more popular down south and in Pennsylvania. And this basically is a deed restriction in your deed for your house that says if you buy in this neighborhood, you are agreeing to the following rules and regulations. And it might relate to things such as house color, whether you can have children's play toys out on the lawn. It may tell you how high your lawn has to be cut, what type of plants you can have, what type of fence you can have. They often require annual dues, and members of the homeowners association get together and vote on who runs the association. Personally, I think this is something that was spawned by demons, because I have a hard time with homeowners associations, and I have found in the past that what often happens is the person who is most concerned with making sure everyone follows the rules ends up being the person in charge of the homeowners association. And anyone who's had a difficult neighbor knows how that can make your life very difficult. Minor versions of the homeowners association, which tend to be less intrusive, would be a road association. If you and your neighbors live along a road, it's a dirt road, it's a private road, and you all agree to chip in $100 or $150 every year to get it plowed. Or especially in New England, there are lake associations where everyone around a lake pays into a central fund to have the water tested every year, or to have a dam inspected or repaired or something like that. But those are road associations and lake associations, and much less intrusive on what you can do with your property. So, you've looked at your property and you've decided, I want it, I'm going to buy it, let's do this, let's go for it. You're going to end up working with a real estate agent. Always the agent representing the seller. You may use the same agent, or you may choose to use your own real estate agent to represent you. The key is to understand who the agent represents. The agent representing the seller of the property that you want to buy, their job is to sell that piece of property. It's to represent the interests of the seller and to earn a commission by executing the sale. And most of these people are doing a great job, and they're being nice, and you want to be nice, and it's a nerve-wracking process, and you want to get along with everyone. You need to be a little nudgy. And I'll give you an example of where I wasn't and I should have been when I bought this house right here. I was very concerned. We were buying in the winter, so there was snow on the ground. Where is the septic system? And I kept asking, and I felt bad about kept pushing the issue like I was doing something wrong. And the seller's real estate agent finally said, it's right over there. See where there's a mound of snow? It's right outside. And I finally accepted that as the answer, and we went through with the sale. Come spring, we find out that the septic system was not visible. There was no pump out infrastructure above the ground. So we had to find it. And when we finally found it, after digging holes and putting down metal bars to see if we could find it, we found it was 5 feet from our drinking water well. We ended up drilling a whole new well somewhere else. You can fall in love with property. It's very easy to, and you want to get it done, and it's nerve-wracking, and there's a million moving pieces and all these people involved. You need to be your own best advocate. And don't be afraid of being a little bit of a nudge, because this, as I said, is going to be your biggest and most substantial investment in your life. You don't want to be surprised. When you purchase a house, you're going to want to put 20% down. And the reason for that is this. Number one, the interest rate you get on your loan for your house is going to depend on a number of factors. Your credit score, which we've talked about many, many times, and how much money you're putting down. Those are two big factors. The more money you put down, the easier it's going to be to get you approved for your mortgage, because the bank is going to say, okay, this is a good risk. Plus, if you put down less than 20%, you're probably going to have to buy mortgage insurance. And you have to pay for that. In other words, that's the bank's guarantee that you're not going to fall behind on your mortgage. 20% is pretty much the cutoff point when you won't have to buy that. So you save yourself money by saving in the first place and putting down a good 20%. You will have to pay for a title search, which is the person who researches all the records, who owned this property before you and before them and before them and before them. And all those deeds are recorded in your county registry of deeds. They're going to tell you, were there any reversion interests, meaning someone else can take the property? Was there a mortgage that was never paid? Is there an easement that someone had a long time ago that still exists and hasn't been taken care of? That's something you're going to have to have done. And no bank, frankly, is going to give you a mortgage unless you have clear title, which means the title company has done this research and is making a positive statement. We stand behind this work, that this title is free and clear and can be conveyed without any encumbrances. Keep in mind, you buy a $200,000 house, you put 20% down. That means you're borrowing $160,000. All right? In this day and age, with low mortgage rates of 3%, and you put down a good 20%, that $160,000 loan is still going to cost you $270,000 over its life. It's a big investment, and that's just the mortgage. You may go online and do some mortgage calculations and find that, oh good, my mortgage payment's only $700 a month. You have to pay property taxes along with your mortgage, and that could be $300-400 more per month. You have to pay your homeowner's insurance on top of that along with your mortgage, and that's going to be another $100 a month. So finding out you're only going to have to pay $700 a month for a mortgage will probably lead to you paying $1,100 or $1,200 a month for that mortgage. So you want to make sure you've got all the numbers crunched and in place before you make a commitment to something that you can't afford. It wasn't that long ago, 2007, 2008, many people got mortgages for houses that sold at very high prices, and they may have owed $200,000 on them. And when the real estate market crashed, they found they had a house that they could only sell for $150,000 and they owed $200,000. That's called being underwater. It doesn't happen a lot. It happens cyclically. It may happen every 5 or 6 or 7 years that housing prices begin to decline and we have a recession, but it does happen. If you're in real estate for the short term, we want to buy a house for 6 or 7 years, that's a real possibility. If you're in it for the long term, history has shown that real estate prices over the long term generally increase with time. So you've got a fairly safe investment as long as you're not looking to get in and get out very quickly. So that was a race through real estate and what you need to be aware of and look forward to as you begin to look at the most nerve-wracking and largest investment of your lifetime. Tom Simmons signing off.